So welcome back. I got 3 paint packages all on the same day, and we are going to open them and swatch them and then paint something with them because I think it'll be a lot of fun to paint with paints that I've never used before, all in the same painting. I decided to start with 31 Purple Fish because I wanted to see what I got for guppies. Guppy colors are solely for the guppy program for a year period and then may or may not end up in the shop. The first color is Slate Brown, and then we have Peach Pie. I'm really excited about Slate Brown. I've been working on adding more neutrals to my 31 Purple Fish palette for a bit. I always start by pre-wetting my colors. I find that it works best no matter the paint brand. I also add a silver dot to any of my paint swatches that are in traditional quarter, half, or full pans, just so that I know that they're not in my studio palette when I'm flipping through my swatch book. It just makes it easy to be able to figure out at a glance if the paint will be in my studio palette or if it's going to be in a palette of its own. I always label my swatches with a Staedtler pigment liner in 0.05, which is the smallest size they come in. Slate Brown is a very pretty brown that almost matches my desk once it's dry. I do decide to do a diluted version of it. I tend to do diluted versions for any color that seems to granulate or has a big color shift from light to dark, just so that I know when I'm going to be using it in different applications, because I do often paint wet on wet, and when you paint wet on wet, the colors are often more diluted. Peach Pie reminds me a bit of Grapefruit by 31 Purple Fish, but is also like less fluorescent than Grapefruit. It looks like it has a whole bunch of hot pink to it. I'm gonna have to play around with it more because I do really like it. I did end up putting it in with Grapefruit when I was organizing my palette, just because I felt like that's where it sort of fit. I do think it's important when you're organizing your palette to just put out all your swatches and sort of see where things sort of line up. I find that that's the best way I have for organizing my palette. Next up, we have one of the Facebook swaps, and I can't remember what I actually traded for. I knew it was brands that I didn't have in my palette, plus a couple Daniel Smiths, but I couldn't remember the colors that I chose. She also included paper samples, which I was really excited about because they are some papers that I've been wanting to try, like the Jacksons and the Bao Hong papers, which is absolutely great. I love doing trades like this because you get to try supplies that you might not necessarily get to try. I also really appreciated that she put all the pigment numbers on the bottom of the pans because that made it super easy to figure out what colors were which. All of these paints were in quarter pans just because I wasn't sure if I was going to like them. And it was a selection of Daniel Smith, Da Vinci, and Core, which both Da Vinci and Core are brand new to my palette, and the Daniel Smith colors are colors that I like in other brands, but I wasn't sure if I'd like the Daniel Smith version, and while I like them in other brands, there are things that I don't necessarily like about them, but I think my issues with them are formula, not pigment. So I wanted to try them out in a different brand just to see if it was actually a formula issue that I didn't like or if it was actually the pigment. There were definitely a couple where once I had them swatched, I went, oh, I could have definitely gotten a half pan of this, but you never really know that, and so I think it's always better to order a quarter pan or order a dot card and work your way up from there. In this case, though, I was quite happy to just do quarter pans because then they fit in my palette, I can throw them in a travel palette, and everything's great. So this is Phthalo Yellow Green, which is a PG7. And it's not what I've come to expect from PG7s. Normally they're a lot more toned down, and so I only got a little pan of it, and I did definitely regret it because I really like it. It is a lot brighter and sort of a lot cleaner of a bright color. I have other colors that are bright like this, but they tend to have white in them, whereas this is just PG7, which I really like. So I will definitely be investing in a tube of this at some point. Next up we have Perylene Violet, which is PV29. I've got the Roman small version of this, and I think my issue is formulation, because I do like Roman small paints. There are just a couple colors that I don't absolutely love in their brand, and Perylene Violet's one of them, where I do like the color. I'm just not a huge fan of sort of how it interacts with other paints. So I'm going to have to play around with the Daniel Smith version and see if it's, you know, just the pigment not playing nice with other paints, or is this an issue of just whatever they've had to add in to the paint not playing nice with others. This is Quinacridone Rose, and I really like it. It's a PV19. I got two different versions of Quinacridone Rose in this palette selection, just because I have the Michael Wilcox version and the Roman small version of, I think it's Quinacridone Red is their version of Quinacridone Rose. It's PV19. This is Core Sap Green, which, if you don't know, when I try out a brand, I tend to do Sap Green, Indigo, and Quinacridone Gold hue, or their version of Quinacridone Gold. Those are colors that I use fairly frequently, and so I find that they're a good sort of place to start when looking at a brand. They give me somewhere good to work off of. And so in the case of Core, I got Indigo and Sap Green because this is what was available in the swap group. And it gave me the ability to look at the colors that I was interested in. I did really like the Core Sap Green. I wasn't as big of a fan of the Indigo. It leaned a little bit too sort of phthalo blue turquoise for me, which was disappointing. I'm gonna have to play around with it with other paints, because I've heard that it doesn't play super nice with others. And so if that holds true with all the handmade paints in my palette, then it won't be something I repurchase. This is Da Vinci Quinacridone Rose, and you can really see the color difference. These are the same pigments, one's Daniel Smith, one's Da Vinci. I actually prefer the Daniel Smith version. I really like the hot pink, which surprises me. Normally I'm more of like the toned down pink. I don't use a whole bunch of hot pink. I do use Quinacridone Magenta, but it's a bright pink that's like sort of slightly more toned down. This is Cobalt Blue by Da Vinci. I don't know that I like it more than the Daniel Smith Cobalt Blue. What I did was I bought lots of the Daniel Smith colors I really liked that were available from Da Vinci, mostly sticking with single pigments. I think every Da Vinci color I got was a single pigment. The core colors weren't, but all of the Daniel Smith and all of the Da Vinci were. This is Cobalt Turquoise. This is sort of what I was looking for with the Rosa Galleries one, where it's the pigment that I wanted with the Rosa Galleries, but it's not quite the color that I wanted. After I've compared it to the Daniel Smith and the Rosa Galleries, even though the Rosa Galleries is a mix and not the pure pigment, I like the Rosa Galleries ones more, and the Daniel Smith one is still my favorite, which is a bit disappointing because it is quite expensive in Canada, and I was hoping to find a substitute that I liked as much that was the same pigment. But I'm sure I'll find something at some point. This is the Da Vinci Ultramarine Blue. I have a thing for ultramarine blues. I have many of them. I think this is my 8th or 9th ultramarine blue. It's another one of those colors that I find really good to test a brand with, because it's one of those pigments that looks pretty different across brands, where depending on how it's mulled, you'll have different granulation. and so I like to just look at it because it does look different. And it tends to not be super expensive, so if you want to test out a brand and like look at different pigments, Ultramarine Blue is one of the ones I look at. This is their Phthalo Blue. I have several Phthalo Blues, and it would just happen to be I wanted to get a couple more from Vinci, and it happened to be a good one to test. Now that they're dry, you can really see the difference between the Daniel Smith and the Vinci, and I really like that green. It makes me really happy. Finally, we have an absolutely massive package, also from a Facebook swap. I traded a whole bunch of handmade dots and paints that I was no longer using, and she sent me Schmincke dots and some half pans, and I was so excited to finally get my hands on these colors. I do have some of the Schmincke super granulatings. I don't have a bunch. I tend to borrow my mom's collection when I want to use them, but there were some that mom didn't have that I did want to try out, and so finding them in the swap group was the perfect opportunity to get to test them out. I also love how she had this packaged. Everything was so secure. The dots were individually wrapped so that nothing got smudged. We were having super high humidity here, and so everything took a bit to dry, including my end of the last trade. So I was really happy that everything was wrapped in a way that if things got stuck in the mail and got humid and accidentally reactivated, wet paint wasn't going to get everywhere. So I had 3 dot cards. One was the super granulating colors, one was some Rembrandt colors, and one was some of the supervision colors. I do have some of the supervision colors. I've used them in a couple pieces, and then these were all the pans, and I love how they were packaged because they were not going anywhere. I had to fight to get these off of the packaging, and I personally think that's a sign of great packaging. So some of these are in half pans and some of these are in quarter pans, and I love how she put a little piece of something there so that even if they reactivated, they weren't going to stick to the packaging or anything. It was a fight to get into this packaging, and I loved it because none of these paints were going anywhere. At this point, I probably should have just used scissors again, but I was determined to get into them, only having to cut one of the strings, and so I fought with it for a little bit because, well, I could and I wanted to be able to do it. And then I remembered I'd gotten 2 more quarter pans, and that might have been part of the problem. The colors I got in quarter pans, one of them was because I knew I didn't absolutely love it from the swatches, but I did still want to try it. One of them was because mom has it in her palette, and I knew I did want it so that I could have it in a travel palette, but I didn't need it in a half pan. And one of them was because I already have Tundra Violet from 2 other brands with very similar pigments, potentially the same pigments, and I didn't want to commit to a half pan until I knew how similar it looked to the ones I already had in my palette. So this is Cobalt Violet Hue by Schmincke, which is PV62. No other brand makes it. I can't find any pigment supplier that carries it, and so it's become a bit of a mystery, and so I had to have a pan of it. I'm not necessarily sure that I like the color. I've got a lot of purples in my palette that I really do like, but it was sort of a mystery pigment that I felt like I needed to test, seeing as Schmincke was the only person that had it in their line and I couldn't find anyone that carried it. This black paint that's wrapped in cling film was another one of those sort of mystery paints. It's a black that should be easier to find than it is. It's PBK7, which is technically Schmincke Anthracite. This version, though, is by White Knights because I couldn't actually find Schmincke Anthracite anywhere that stocks Schmincke. I think I'm going to swatch the dark cards last and start with the pans, just for the sake of wanting to see the colors that are in the pans. We actually have a 50-50 split between supergranulating and non-supergranulating colors, which I think is great. I accidentally contaminate the yellow. I didn't realize I still had green on my brush, so I decide I'm just going to wet all the colors and then organize them into sort of an order I like while they reactivate. I don't always do this, but because there's a yellow, I just want to make sure that I've got everything set up the way I want it to. Volcano Yellow is actually the same pigment as Winsor Nude and Lemon Yellow Deep, which is sort of my favorite non-traditional yellow. It granulates quite a lot, and Winsor Nude is the only brand to have it in their full line. I'm interested to compare the Schmincke version to it because it costs about the same, but is marketed as limited edition by Schmincke. This is Deep Sea Violet, which I sort of regret getting in this little pan. It's a really cool color. It was difficult to reactivate. I think it could have probably used some more time to reactivate, but I do really, really like the color. I did end up doing a diluted swatch for all of the Schmincke super granulating colors, which is what I tend to do with them, just so that I know how they look diluted. It sort of reminds me of like children's grape flavored cough syrup color wise, just that shade of purple. I'm not going to go over the pigment numbers for all the super granulating colors, but I will leave that information below. This is Galaxy Violet. I have a couple very similar colors, one from Cosmic Creations and two from 31 Purple Fish. One that is actually called Galaxy Haze. It's a purple that tends to granulate with some pink to it, pinky brown. We have Tundra Pink, which is my favorite pink in the super granulating line, I think I can say now. I think I've tried them all. I really don't like Galaxy Pink, but I do really like Tundra Pink. I did only get a quarter pan of it though, because Mom does have a half pan of it in her palette, and when I need to borrow it, I tend just to borrow her palette, but I wanted this for a travel set. This is Tundra Blue, which is also one of my favorite colors in the super granulating set. I think the Tundra palette is probably my favorite palette. Tundra Blue is really cool because it can be mixed with other colors to make them granulate. And so you can sort of get a rainbow granulating palette with only 3 colors. Next up is Cobalt Violet Hue, which is PV62. I feel meh about it at this point. I have some pretty similar purples already in my palette from other brands, like granulation-wise and even color-wise. And so even though it's a pigment that I couldn't find anywhere else and that no other like pigment people that I was talking to had even heard of, it sort of just feels meh. And so I don't quite know how I feel about it. I thought it was going to be more interesting than it was. I was expecting more. I was expecting more granulation. I was expecting, you know, cobalt violet granulates and has such amazing granulation to it. And this just sort of falls flat. It's opaque. It feels chalky. I got two different browns. One is Mahogany brown and the other is Mars brown. I got the Mars brown because I only had one PBR6 in my palette, and I just wanted to see if there was as much of a PBR6 difference as there was a PBR7 difference, and there is a PBR6 difference. Mahogany brown is PBR 33, which I haven't seen in other brands. That's not to say there aren't other brands that make it, but Schmincke was the only brand that I could find it in, and so I decided to pick it up. This is Winsor Noon Viridian, and I'm on a quest to find a Viridian that I actually like. So far, it's Winsor Noon is ahead of Daniel Smith. I think I like the Holbein Hue one more, but it is a mix of pigments, I believe, and so it's not technically what I'm aiming for in looking for a new Viridian in my palette. Finally, we have Lamp Black by White Nights, and I can't get over how black and opaque this color is. I had heard that PBK7 was like that, but seeing it in person is so different than hearing about it or looking at swatches of it online. It is so opaque and so black. I thought Chinchilla by Addison and Sedgwick was as opaque as it gets, and I just can't get over this black. I'm really hoping I can get my hands on the Schmincke version at some point soon, because it is such a cool color. I'm fairly sure Jackson's has it in the tubes. I just don't like ordering tubes internationally. I find that the air pressure change results in tubes leaking, and so I try not to order tubes from other countries whenever possible. I sort of have a love-hate relationship with the Supervision paints. I have a single 3 set, and I don't use them all that often compared to my other granulating colors. They tend to granulate in a more uniform way, and I'm never quite sure how to use them. Rubia Purple, though, is quite lovely, and I'm pretty sure I'll be adding it to my palette at some point. I do always pre-wet my colors even for dots, as I find they work better that way. Red Violet really does remind me of Tundra Violet. Next up is the Super Granulating Dot card, and I'm quite excited for these. So she didn't have enough to put these paints in pans, and so they became a dot card, though they're quite generous dots, and they're probably closer to the 0.5 ml pan size for most of them. I do have some of the haze colors and one of the deep sea colors in Deep Sea Violet. The rest of the colors, though, are new to me, and I'm interested to see if I'll end up picking up any in pans or tubes in the near future. I decided to do these wet on wet just because I wanted to really see what the granulation looked like, and I find that works best. I do have haze blue in my palette as well as haze indigo, and I've had them for a few months and really enjoy them. I got them in tubes. And while you don't often see them in pieces I post, I do use them in pieces that I play around with and don't end up filming. Haze Pink is another one of the pinks that contains PR233, which is Potter's Pink. And I wanted to include it in my Potter's Pink video, but I didn't have the color at the time. These Rembrandt colors were super cool. They, unlike normal shimmers, contain, I believe, glass particles, is what I've been told. I have never actually seen them in a store. I think they're only available online in Canada, though you might be able to find them in store a few places. I have quite a large collection of shimmers, so it's rare that I add anything new these days, but when we were discussing these paints and she brought up the fact that she was willing to put a dot card together for these, I just decided why not, and that I did actually want to try them. It is quite hard to capture them inside, I found, and unlike normal shimmers where they sort of have like a base to them that's sparkly as well, they remind me much more of a glitter paint where they don't really have that base to them. There's no tint to the base, it's just binder. And so any of the color you're getting is just color from the sparkle. I did really like the top color, and I think if I was going to add any to my collection, it would be that one. They do work better with flash, but these days I'm more of a fan of metallics that are a bit less finicky to use, as we don't get a whole bunch of sunny days a year, and so being able to photograph metallics as they should be in natural sunlight is difficult. For all the people that say, well, you get these paints and you never paint with them once you get them, here you go. I am going to paint with only the paints that I just bought and received. I have picked a random reference image that I think works with the color palette I got. I will leave the link to the reference image below, and we're just going to go for it. I don't know why the camera's autofocus is being weird. I think it just doesn't like this gray paintbrush. I decided to start wet on wet. It's the Fabriano paper. This block is almost done, and they don't make this size of block anymore. It makes me really sad. I'm not going to leave links to the colors below, just because I don't necessarily know what colors were what and what I was reaching for. I was just sort of reaching random. So instead, I'm just going to link to all the colors that I got in this video. And I hope you enjoy. It was definitely a fun piece to paint. It's rare that I just jump into painting with only new paints right away. I like to play around with them a little bit more, but it was definitely fun. There is also a moment in this where the camera dies and I have to switch over to a different camera, so I apologize. It was late. We were having some tech issues, but I do think it's really interesting to watch the process of painting with paints where I've really only had them for, at this point, maybe 40 minutes. All of these colors, and it is 7 different brands, I think, maybe 8. So I hope you enjoy watching.